The year was 69 AD, and Rome was burning. Not literally this time, but politically, financially, and psychologically. The empire that had once conquered the known world now stood on the edge of implosion. Nero, the tyrant artist who had fiddled while the city burned and bankrupted the treasury to fund his golden palace, was dead. He had slit his own throat in a shabby villa outside Rome, whimpering his final words, "What an artist dies in me." The Senate had declared him a public enemy. The people had cheered his demise, but the relief was short-lived. What followed was not peace, but chaos. The year of the four emperors, a brutal, rapid-fire succession of military strongmen clawing their way to the throne, plunged Rome into civil war. Galba, an aging senator with a reputation for cruelty and stinginess, ruled for 7 months before being hacked to pieces in the Forum by the Praetorian Guard. Otho, a former companion of Nero, seized power next, only to commit suicide after losing a single battle to his rival. Vitellius, a gluttonous general beloved by his troops but despised by everyone else, gorged himself on power for 8 months before being dragged through the streets, tortured, and thrown into the Tiber River. Rome had become a slaughterhouse. Legions turned on each other, the streets ran red, the economy collapsed. By the time Titus Flavius Vespasian, better known as Vespasian, marched into Rome in December of 69 AD, the empire was hemorrhaging gold, dignity, and hope. The imperial treasury was empty. Nero's extravagances, the Domus Aurea, the vast palace complex that covered a third of the city, dripping with gold leaf and ivory, had drained Rome's coffers. The Civil War had only made things worse. Soldiers demanded bonuses. Provincial governors demanded reinforcements. The grain supply from Egypt was disrupted. Inflation soared. Public works crumbled. The Senate was paralyzed by fear and infighting. Rome needed a miracle, or at the very least, a competent accountant.
Vespasian was neither a miracle nor a visionary. He was a soldier, a middling nobleman from the Italian countryside, the son of the tax collector, a man who had spent decades commanding legions in Britain and Judea. He was 60 years old, stocky, balding, with a face that ancient historians described as perpetually looking like he was straining on the toilet. He had no charisma, no divine ancestry, no poet singing his praises. He was, in the words of one senator, aggressively unremarkable. But he had 3 things going for him. He was competent, he was ruthless, and he was still alive. Rome didn't need another Nero. It needed someone who could balance a budget and keep the legions from tearing each other apart. Vespasian fit the bill. But there was a problem. The empire was broke. Not a little short on funds broke. Not we'll have to raise taxes broke. It was the treasury is literally empty and we owe millions of sesterces to soldiers who will kill us if we don't pay them broke. Nero's spending spree had cost Rome an estimated 2.2 billion sesterces, roughly equivalent to 2 full years of imperial revenue. The Civil War had cost even more. Vespasian needed cash, fast, and he was willing to do absolutely anything to get it. This is where the story gets strange, because Vespasian's solution to Rome's financial crisis wasn't to raise taxes on the wealthy, or to cut spending, or to reform the bureaucracy. No, Vespasian's solution was to tax everything. And I mean everything. He taxed grain, he taxed wine, he taxed prostitutes, he taxed the provinces, he taxed the Jews, he even taxed the right to collect taxes. But his most infamous, most absurd, most enduring fiscal policy was this. He taxed urine.
Yes, urine. Human waste.
the stuff people peed into public urinals and left to ferment in clay pots on street corners. Vespasian looked at the steaming, stinking rivers of Roman piss and saw gold. And he was right. But before we get to the pee tax, and trust me, we will, we need to understand the man who imposed it, because Vespasian wasn't just a pragmatist, he was a psychologist. He understood that power in Rome wasn't just about military strength or divine right. It was about perception. It was about branding. And Vespasian, despite his lack of charisma, was one of the most effective political operators Rome ever produced. He knew he couldn't inspire awe like Augustus, or terror like Caligula, or devotion like Julius Caesar. So instead, he did something even smarter. He made himself indispensable. He made himself the man who saved Rome by doing the dirty work no one else would do. His political instincts were razor sharp. He cultivated a public persona of blunt, earthy pragmatism. He cracked jokes about his own humble origins. He mocked the aristocracy. He ate with common soldiers. He walked around Rome without a retinue, inspecting public works, haggling with contractors, personally auditing provincial accounts. He wanted Romans to see him as one of them, a working-class emperor who got his hands dirty. And it worked. The Senate hated him. The poets ignored him. But the soldiers loved him, the merchants respected him, and the people tolerated him because he made the aqueducts run on time.
But Vespasian had one weakness, one insecurity that gnawed at him every day. He wasn't noble enough. He wasn't a patrician. He wasn't descended from gods or kings. His father was a tax collector. His grandfather was a common soldier. In a city where bloodlines mattered more than ability, where senators traced their ancestry back to Aeneas and Romulus, Vespasian was a nobody, and he knew it. Every time he walked into the Senate, he could feel their contempt. Every time he attended a state ceremony, he could sense their sneers. He was the emperor, yes, but he wasn't their emperor. So Vespasian did what every insecure ruler in history has done. He tried to reinvent himself. He tried to manufacture legitimacy. He tried to wrap himself in myth and legend and divine association. And the god he chose, awkwardly, earnestly, almost pathetically, was Hercules. Hercules, the ultimate Roman hero. The demigod who had strangled serpents in his cradle, slain the Nemean lion, cleaned the Augean stables, descended into the underworld, and ascended to Olympus. Hercules was strength incarnate. He was the patron of soldiers, laborers, and working men. He was the bridge between gods and mortals, the hero who earned immortality through sheer effort and suffering. For an emperor like Vespasian, practical, working class, self-made, Hercules was the perfect symbol. But here's the thing, Vespasian wasn't Hercules. He wasn't even close. Hercules was a titan of myth, a figure of cosmic power and tragic grandeur. Vespasian was a 60-year-old bureaucrat with a dad bod and a receding airline. Hercules strangled lions. Vespasian audited tax returns. The comparison was, to put it mildly, a stretch. And yet, Vespasian committed to it, fully, desperately, almost comically. The propaganda machine kicked into overdrive. Statues of Vespasian began appearing across Rome, draped in lion skins, wielding clubs, posed in the heroic stance of Hercules. Coins were minted with Vespasian's profile on one side and Hercules on the other, the implication clear. The emperor was the living embodiment of the ancient hero. State ceremonies were staged where Vespasian performed symbolic labors, inspecting public works as if he were cleaning the Augean stables, presiding over gladiatorial games as if he were conquering beasts in the arena. Poets were commissioned to write odes comparing Vespasian's military campaigns in Judea to Hercules' 12 labors. The Senate, of course, played along. They had no choice. But behind closed doors, they rolled their eyes.
Because everyone could see what Vespasian was doing. He was trying to buy legitimacy with symbolism. He was trying to manufacture a divine connection that didn't exist. And the problem wasn't just that the comparison was absurd, it was that Vespasian himself seemed to know it was absurd. He wasn't delusional like Caligula, who genuinely believed he was a god. He wasn't self-serious like Nero, who thought his artistic genius justified his tyranny. Vespasian was too pragmatic, too self-aware to truly believe he was Hercules. But he needed people to believe it, or at least to pretend they believed it. The psychology here is fascinating. Vespasian understood that in Rome, legitimacy was a performance. The emperor wasn't just a political leader, he was a symbol, a myth, a living embodiment of Roman power. Augustus had understood this. He had carefully cultivated the image of the first citizen, the humble servant of the republic, all while consolidating absolute power. Tiberius had failed at it, retreating to Capri and letting rumors of depravity destroy his reputation. Caligula and Nero had overplayed their hands, drowning in their own megalomania. Vespasian was trying to find a middle ground, a myth that was just believable enough, just modest enough to work. But the Hercules branding had another purpose, one that went beyond legitimacy. It was a signal to the Roman people that Vespasian was strong, that he could rebuild the empire through sheer force of will, that he would labor, like Hercules, to restore order and prosperity. It was a message to the legions that their general emperor was still one of them, still willing to fight, still capable of heroic deeds. And it was a message to the Senate that Vespasian wasn't going anywhere. He had the divine mandate now. He had Hercules on his side. Of course, the whole campaign was undermined by one glaring irony. The money to fund all this propaganda, the statues, the coins, the ceremonies, the poets, came from the most undignified source imaginable. Vespasian was trying to present himself as a mythic hero, a demigod of strength and virtue, and he was paying for it with urine.
To understand why Vespasian taxed urine, you first need to understand what urine was actually used for in ancient Rome. Because this wasn't just a bizarre tax on waste, this was a tax on one of the most economically valuable commodities in the empire. Urine, specifically stale fermented urine, was an industrial powerhouse. The Romans didn't have modern detergents, bleaches, or chemical cleaners. What they had was ammonia, and the best natural source of ammonia was human urine, left to sit and ferment until the urea broke down into ammonium carbonate. This liquid gold was used in three major industries: fulling and textile cleaning. Fullers, the workers who cleaned, whitened, and softened woolen cloth, soaked fabric in giant vats of fermented urine. The ammonia broke down grease, removed stains, and gave the cloth a bright, clean finish. Every toga, every tunic, every piece of fabric in Rome passed through urine at some point. Tanning and leatherwork. Tanners used urine to treat animal hides, softening the leather and removing hair. The smell was revolting, which is why tanneries were pushed to the outskirts of the city, but the process was essential.
Dye fixing. Urine was used to set dyes in fabric, ensuring that colors didn't fade or bleed. The purple dye that marked senators' togas, the red of military cloaks, all of it was stabilized with ammonia from urine. In short, urine was everywhere in the Roman economy. It was cheap, abundant, and absolutely necessary. And here's the key. It was waste. It belonged to no one. Or at least, it hadn't belonged to anyone until Vespasian arrived. The system worked like this. Public urinals, known as latrines or Vespasians in later slang, were scattered throughout Rome. These were simple clay pots or troughs placed at street corners, in alleyways, near public baths. Men would relieve themselves into these containers, and workers, usually slaves or the urban poor, would collect the urine, load it into amphorae, and sell it to fullers and tanners. It was a thriving, if disgusting, industry.
Vespasian looked at this system and had a revelation. Here was a commodity that was produced daily by every citizen in Rome. It was collected, transported, bought and sold. It generated real economic value. And yet, the government was making absolutely nothing from it. In Vespasian's mind, this was insane. Why should private entrepreneurs profit from a resource that was, technically, public? Why shouldn't the state take a cut?
So he imposed a tax, not on the urine itself. That would have been too direct, too crude. Instead, he taxed the collectors. Anyone who gathered urine from public urinals and sold it to fullers or tanners had to pay a fee to the state. It was a licensing system, essentially. If you wanted to make money off piss, you paid the emperor first. The announcement was met with stunned silence, then outrage, then, eventually, exhausted laughter. The Senate was horrified. How could the Emperor of Rome, the heir to Augustus, the commander of legions, the representative of Jupiter himself, tax human waste? It was degrading. It was beneath the dignity of the empire. One senator reportedly stood up during a session and shouted, "Are we so low that we must squeeze gold from our own filth?" Vespasian's response was immediate, blunt, and legendary. He held up a gold coin, fresh from the mint, and said, "Pecunia non olet." Money does not stink.
It was a perfect encapsulation of Vespasian's worldview. He didn't care where the money came from, as long as it came. He didn't care about dignity or tradition or the sensibilities of the aristocracy. He cared about keeping the empire running, keeping the legions paid, keeping the aqueducts flowing. And if that meant taxing piss, so be it. The economics were sound. Rome's fulling and tanning industries required thousands of amphorae of urine every single day. The demand was constant. The supply was infinite. And because urine was a low-cost, high-volume commodity, even a small tax generated massive revenue. Vespasian's administration estimated that the urine tax brought in tens of millions of sesterces annually, enough to fund public works, repair the Forum, and begin construction on the Colosseum, which Vespasian funded in part by melting down Nero's golden statues and taxing everything in sight. But the brilliance of the tax wasn't just economic, it was psychological. Vespasian was sending a message. No resource is too small, no industry too humble, no source of revenue too undignified to be tapped. He was signaling to the empire that he would do whatever it took to restore Rome's finances. And he was daring anyone, senators, philosophers, satirists, to challenge him. Most didn't, because deep down they knew he was right. Money didn't stink, and Rome needed money more than it needed pride.
To the elite of Rome, the senators in their marble villas, the poets composing odes in perfumed gardens, the urine tax was an abstraction, a joke, a scandalous talking point over wine. But to the men and women who actually worked in the urine trade, it was life. It was survival. And it was far more complex, far more human than Vespasian's critics ever acknowledged. The workers who collected urine were among the lowest of the low in Roman society. Many were slaves. Others were freedmen, immigrants, or desperate urban poor, scraping together a living in the chaotic sprawl of Rome's slums. They woke before dawn, hauled heavy amphorae through narrow streets, emptied stinking clay pots, and delivered their loads to fullers and tanners on the outskirts of the city. The work was brutal, humiliating, and essential. But it was also, in a strange way, entrepreneurial. The urine trade operated as a kind of informal market. Collectors competed for the best locations, high traffic areas near public baths, busy markets, taverns where men drank and pissed in abundance. Some collectors made deals with property owners, paying a small fee to place urinals near their buildings in exchange for exclusive access.
Others tried to monopolize certain neighborhoods, intimidating rivals or bribing local officials. There were even reports of urine theft, collectors sneaking into competitors' territories at night, emptying their pots and selling the contents as their own.
The fulleries, the workshops where cloth was cleaned and processed, were the backbone of the industry. These were large, cavernous buildings filled with vats of fermenting urine, where workers, often barefoot, trampled fabrics in the stinking liquid for hours at a time. The smell was overpowering. Ancient sources described the stench of a fullery as something that could be detected blocks away, a sour, acrid odor that clung to clothes and skin. The workers, fullers, were social outcasts, mocked in graffiti and satirical poems for their association with filth. And yet they were indispensable. Without fullers, there were no clean togas, no bright white senatorial robes, no presentable clothing. Rome's obsession with cleanliness and appearance depended entirely on people willing to wade through rivers of piss. Tanners had it even worse. Tanning was done outside the city walls, in dedicated districts downwind from residential areas. The process involved soaking animal hides in vats of urine mixed with dung, scraping off hair and fat, and then treating the leather with more ammonia to soften it. The smell was so foul that the Roman government passed laws restricting where tanneries could be built. But the leather they produced, used for military sandals, shields, armor, furniture, and more, was critical to the empire's economy. When Vespasian imposed the urine tax, it didn't just affect the wealthy tanners or fullery owners. It trickled down to the collectors, the slaves, the laborers. Many had to pay a portion of their earnings to the state just for the right to gather and sell urine. For some, this was survivable, an annoyance but not a catastrophe. For others, it was devastating. Profit margins were already thin. The competition was fierce. Adding a tax on top of everything else pushed some collectors out of the business entirely.
But the tax also had an unexpected consequence. It standardized the industry. Before Vespasian, the urine trade was chaotic, unregulated, a free-for-all. After the tax, the government had a vested interest in monitoring the flow of urine, ensuring that collectors were paying their fees, that supply chains were functioning, that the revenue kept coming in. Suddenly, there were inspectors, registries, official permits. The state bureaucracy, always hungry for control, wrapped its tentacles around the urine economy. And in a strange way, this legitimized the trade. It was no longer just a black market hustle. It was an official industry, recognized and taxed by the emperor himself. The people of Rome reacted with a mixture of outrage, amusement, and resignation. Graffiti mocking the urine tax appeared on walls across the city. One surviving inscription, scrawled near a public urinal, reads, "Here I piss for Vespasian's coffers." Satirical poems circulated, imagining the emperor personally inspecting urinals, sniffing amphorae, counting sesterces earned from Roman bladders. Street performers mocked Vespasian in crude sketches, portraying him as a miser so desperate for cash that he would tax the air itself if he could. But beneath the humor was a grudging acceptance. Because the truth was, Vespasian's logic made sense. The urine tax was absurd, yes. It was undignified, yes. But it worked. It generated revenue. It stabilized the economy. And after years of chaos and bankruptcy, Rome was willing to tolerate a little indignity if it meant the empire stayed afloat. The psychological shift was subtle but profound. Romans had always prided themselves on their superiority, their refinement, their distance from the barbarism of other peoples. But Vespasian forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Even the mightiest empire ran on dirty, unglamorous, humiliating work. The legions marched in sandals made by piss-soaked tanners. The senators wore togas cleaned in vats of fermented urine. The Colosseum, Rome's greatest monument, was funded in part by a tax on human waste. The empire's grandeur was built on a foundation of filth. And once you accepted that, once you swallowed your pride and looked at the system honestly, the urine tax stopped being a scandal and became just another fact of Roman life.
The urine tax didn't just provoke economic consequences, it ignited a cultural war. The elite of Rome, the poets, the philosophers, the senators, saw the tax as a symbolic assault on Roman dignity. They weaponized humor, satire, and public scorn, turning Vespasian into a punchline. But Vespasian, with his blunt political instincts, did something unexpected. He leaned into the joke. He owned the narrative, and in doing so, he won. The first wave of resistance came from the Senate. These men, descendants of ancient patrician families, guardians of Roman tradition, were horrified. They had tolerated Vespasian's other tax hikes, his aggressive provincial tributes, his shameless monetization of state functions. But taxing urine? That was a bridge too far. One senator, Helvidius Priscus, openly mocked Vespasian in the Senate chamber, calling him the emperor who counts his coins in the latrines. Another compared him to Midas, except instead of turning everything to gold, Vespasian turned gold into excrement. The insults were cutting, clever, and widely repeated. But Vespasian didn't flinch. He had spent his entire career being underestimated, mocked, and dismissed by the aristocracy. He knew he couldn't outnoble them, couldn't outculture them, couldn't win their respect through traditional means. So instead, he changed the rules of the game. He made his pragmatism, his willingness to do the dirty work, into a political asset.
The satirists were more dangerous than the senators. Rome's poets and playwrights had honed satire into a weapon, and they turned their full arsenal on the urine tax. Martial, the sharp-tongued epigrammatist, wrote verses mocking the emperor's obsession with money, imagining Vespasian personally inspecting public urinals and sniffing amphora to ensure he was getting his cut. Juvenal, the master of bitter social commentary, used the tax as a symbol of Rome's moral decay, lamenting that the empire had fallen so low that even human waste was commodified. Street performers staged crude comedies where actors dressed as Vespasian haggled with urine collectors, counting sesterces while holding their noses. The jokes spread through the city like wildfire. The urine tax became shorthand for Vespasian's character: greedy, shameless, absurd. But here's what his critics didn't anticipate. The jokes made Vespasian relatable. To the common people, the workers, the soldiers, the urban poor, Vespasian's willingness to embrace the ridiculous made him seem human. He wasn't a distant, godlike figure like Augustus. He wasn't a terrifying tyrant like Caligula. He was a man who would tax anything, do anything to keep the empire running. And in a strange way, that was comforting. The turning point came during a famous confrontation with his own son, Titus. According to the historian Suetonius, Titus, then a young man serving as his father's heir, complained about the urine tax, calling it degrading and harmful to the imperial image. Vespasian, with his characteristic bluntness, decided to teach his son a lesson. He held up a gold coin, freshly minted from the revenues of the urine tax, and asked Titus, "Does this smell?" Titus, confused, examined the coin and replied, "No, father." Vespasian smiled. "And yet," he said, "it comes from urine. Pecunia non olet. Money does not stink." The story became legendary. It spread through Rome within days, repeated in taverns, markets, and Senate chambers. And it reframed the entire debate. Vespasian wasn't just defending the tax, he was articulating a philosophy. He was saying, I don't care if the source is ugly, humiliating, or absurd. If it works, if it generates revenue, if it keeps the empire stable, then it's valid.
Morality, dignity, tradition, these are luxuries. Rome can't afford luxuries right now. Rome needs survival.
The Senate hated the argument, but they couldn't refute it. The satirists mocked it, but they couldn't undermine it. Because Vespasian was right. The urine tax worked. It brought in revenue. It stabilized industries. It funded public works. And the longer it stayed in place, the more normal it became. Within a few years, the urine tax was just another part of Roman life. Collectors paid their fees without complaint. Fullers and tanners adjusted their budgets. The government inspectors monitored the trade without fanfare. The initial outrage faded into resignation, then acceptance, then indifference. Romans stopped talking about the tax. They stopped joking about it. It became invisible, part of the background noise of the empire. This is the genius of Vespasian's political strategy. He understood that controversy has a shelf life. If he had apologized or backtracked or tried to justify the tax with elaborate rhetoric, the scandal would have festered. But by embracing the absurdity, by owning the narrative, by turning the criticism into a symbol of his pragmatism, he neutralized it. The urine tax became Vespasian's brand, and over time, that brand became his strength. The psychological lesson here is profound. Vespasian taught Rome and future rulers that you don't need to be loved, you don't need to be respected, you don't even need to be dignified. You just need to be necessary. And if you're necessary, people will tolerate almost anything.
Vespasian died in 79 AD, 10 years after seizing power. According to legend, his final words were delivered with the same dry humor that defined his reign. Vae puto Deus fio. Damn, I think I'm becoming a god. It was a jab at the Roman custom of deifying emperors after death, a tradition Vespasian found absurd. He was a pragmatist to the end, joking about his own mortality even as it arrived. But here's the thing. The urine tax didn't die with him. It survived. It persisted through the reigns of Titus, Domitian, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian. It became a permanent fixture of the Roman fiscal system, outlasting emperors, dynasties, and even the Western Roman Empire itself. The tax that had once been a scandal, a punchline, a symbol of Vespasian's shameless pragmatism, became unremarkable. It was just how things worked. This is the ultimate measure of Vespasian's success. He didn't just impose a controversial policy. He normalized it. He changed the culture. He convinced Rome that even the most absurd, undignified, ridiculous source of revenue could be legitimate if it served the empire's needs. And once that logic took hold, it became impossible to reverse.
The legacy of the urine tax extended far beyond Rome's borders. Centuries later, in 19th century France, public urinals were colloquially known as Vespasiennes, a direct reference to Vespasian and his infamous tax. The term persisted into the 20th century, appearing on street signs and in popular speech. Even today, historians and economists cite the urine tax as a case study in creative taxation, a reminder that governments will monetize anything if they're desperate enough. But Vespasian's legacy is more than just a funny story about taxing piss. It's about what kind of leader he was and what kind of empire Rome had become. Vespasian represented a new breed of emperor, practical, unromantic, willing to do the dirty work that others refused. He wasn't interested in glory or mythology. He was interested in keeping the machinery of empire running. And in a time of chaos, that was exactly what Rome needed. The Hercules branding, of course, didn't stick. No one remembers Vespasian as a mythic hero. The statues of him draped in lion skins were quietly removed or repurposed. The coins comparing him to Hercules stopped circulating. The propaganda campaign faded into obscurity. Vespasian's attempt to manufacture divine legitimacy failed,
But ironically, his failure became his success. Because instead of being remembered as a fake god, he's remembered as a real man, a man who was honest about his ambitions, his limitations, and his willingness to embrace absurdity.
Modern historians credit Vespasian with saving the Roman Empire. He stabilized the economy, reformed the military, rebuilt public infrastructure, and restored confidence in the imperial system. He commissioned the Colosseum, the greatest monument in Roman history, funded by revenues from Judea, melted Neronian gold, and yes, taxes on urine. He reigned for 10 years and died peacefully in his bed, a rarity among Roman emperors. His sons succeeded him without civil war, establishing the Flavian dynasty. By any measure, he was a successful ruler. But the thing that defines Vespasian, the thing that makes him unique, is that he was successful precisely because he was willing to be ridiculous. He understood that dignity is a luxury, that pride can bankrupt an empire, that survival sometimes requires embracing the absurd. He taxed urine because it worked. He owned the criticism because it made him stronger. And he turned his greatest scandal into his most enduring legacy. The psychological lesson here is timeless. Leaders who try to maintain an image of perfection, who refuse to acknowledge reality, who cling to dignity at all costs, often fail. But leaders who are willing to be honest, to be pragmatic, to do the unglamorous work, to laugh at themselves, those leaders survive. And sometimes they thrive. Vespasian's story is a reminder that history doesn't always reward the noble or the charismatic. Sometimes it rewards the competent. Sometimes it rewards the people who are willing to get their hands dirty. And sometimes it rewards the people who can look at a tax on urine and say, pecunia non olet. Money does not stink.
The story of Vespasian and the urine tax is, on the surface, absurd. It's funny, bizarre, almost unbelievable. But beneath the humor lies something deeper. A portrait of an empire at a crossroads, a leader willing to do anything to save it, and a society forced to confront its own contradictions. Vespasian tried to be Hercules. He wanted to be remembered as a hero, a demigod, a figure of mythic strength. But in the end, he's remembered for toilets, for taxing urine, for saying with a straight face that money does not stink. And that's not a failure. It's a triumph. Because Vespasian understood what so many leaders refuse to accept. Survival is more important than dignity. Function is more important than image. And sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is the most unglamorous. Rome needed a savior. What it got was an accountant. And that accountant, with his dry humor and ruthless pragmatism, saved the empire by taxing its citizens' piss.
There's a certain poetry in that. Not the poetry of epic myth or divine grandeur, but the poetry of reality. Messy, unglamorous, stubbornly effective. Vespasian didn't soar to Olympus. He didn't conquer the known world. He didn't inspire songs or legends. But he balanced the budget. He kept the legions paid. He rebuilt the city. And he did it all with a shrug and a smile, as if to say, this is what it takes, deal with it. And Rome did. They grumbled, they joked, they mocked him. But they paid the tax. They accepted the logic. And in the end, they survived. That's the legacy of the emperor who tried to rename himself after Hercules and taxed urine to pay for it. Not a god, not a hero, just a man who understood that empires don't run on glory, they run on gold. Even if that gold comes from the most unlikely,
undignified, ridiculous source imaginable. Pecunia non olet. Money does not stink, and neither, in the end, does Vespasian's legacy.